All right. Before we saddle up, I want to tell you about the Dad Edge Alliance, which is this is a show favorite to ferocious. Thanks for listening to the Emotionally Growth Man Show. Now, go own a show of shit like the powerful, handsome boss man, random irrelevant, confusing over the subject. You are listening to the Emotionally Excellent Man Show, and I'm your host, Jason.
Emotional excellence and
Thunder. Thunder happens when I'm talking about the Dad Alliance. So listen,
learn more about
if you're a guy
in my
and you are feeling like your friendships, your relationships are superficial, you get around, you shoot the shit, but you're never going deeper.
They get
you don't feel safe to do that.
With
saying that there's something more.
A mental illness.
Telling
but I
you,
see so many
join
aspects
this
of their
community.
lives
It is
where they're not.
insanely
There's so many opportunities, I guess, where they
okay,
could
like
better
you got guys in there
themselves
from
or
all
put
walks of life,
practices into place, and I think
but they all have one thing in common:
journey.
they're trying to
So,
elevate
so I'm really
fatherhood
looking forward to exploring that concept
by improving
with you.
themselves.
So when I say
they're
that,
leaning in. They're
does that,
supporting
as
each
a
other. They're learning from
psychotherapist,
one
make
another.
sense
They're
to
learning
you?
about themselves. They're challenging themselves. They're setting
in a
goals.
way,
They're holding each other accountable. But they are all doing it in a place that's totally safe and totally just overflowing with bro love. And I'm trying to say that in a manly way. Bro love.
That's
right?
more
So,
classic model today. A lot of it's about
one of the things that I've learned throughout my own personal
cognitive
development journey, which is a journey that will last the rest of my life, obviously,
actions,
is that the people you surround yourself with are
choices.
that's one of the most important choices you can make. Many of you have probably heard the quote, "You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And when I first heard that, like logically, I got it. Like, okay, that makes sense. But I never could have imagined what it actually meant. How transformative it is to get a better, higher caliber, more open, loving, caring, relentless group of men in your life.
That's why we're
so
talking.
That's what this fucking community provides.
Possible in order to figure it out.
I don't know how to state it in a way that really truly conveys
like cognitive
how I
behavioral
feel
therapy
about
is
it. Like,
different than
I'll just say fuck a lot more.
Say traditional psychotherapy.
But I mean, the stuff that goes on here is crazy. They've got community calls. They've got, accountability teams. They've got amazing content, free books. We're building courses. We have experts come in, New York Times bestselling authors, Navy SEALs to speak to the guys. And the guys are learning and they're growing and they're building relationships with one another and they're bringing a better version of themselves into every aspect of their life. So please think about it. Look around you. Do you have the group of people around you that are going to help you create the fucking life you want? Most people don't. Most people don't even know there's an alternative. And most people don't even understand how important it is. So I'm telling you, from my own personal experience and witnessing hundreds of people have the same experience, it changes everything. Okay, so listen, if you want to know more, you can either always send me a message or you can go to gooddadproject.com/alliance and I'll put that link in the show notes page. Do it. And it will help you become emotionally fucking excellent. Now on to the show.
As I said, we're looking more, and the clues in the word, in the name, cognitive behavioral. It's a behavioral practice. So you're looking at people's behaviors and you're trying to, and there are many different ways that you do that in CBT. One of them is a lot of mapping. So you map people's behaviors. If somebody says, "Oh, I've got a terrible problem going to parties," and so you map that whole journey into the party, the thoughts they have before they get there, what their behaviors are when they get there, and then you look for an exit in that map. And that exit's going to be the point where they're probably reinforcing their deeply held beliefs, and you instead get them to do something else. So don't go and hide in the corner of the party and then believe nobody wants to speak to you. Instead, force yourself out into the middle of the party and initiate conversation. So you're creating behavioral changes without looking back at the influence of childhood or abuse or whatever it may be.
So yeah, because my first wife, as everybody on this who listens to the show knows, I've talked about it a million times, but she was diagnosed with having bipolar disorder and ended up taking her own life. And it was so interesting to learn afterwards that she was sexually abused and physically abused and abandoned and all of these things. And I remember her having her doing or undergoing CBT, and I remember her take on it at the time. I mean, she was in a severely emotionally dysregulated state, I guess, but I remember her take on the time being that she felt like it was just somebody else telling her she was doing something wrong. Like that's, like just going there and walking away from it feeling like it was just another session, I guess, of somebody explaining her another way or another dimension, I guess, in which she didn't measure up and her behavior was incorrect. I don't know if that's a thing that or a perception of people, but are you, so is your, I guess your take on it or your, that, I mean, CBT must work in certain situations or it wouldn't be, I guess it still wouldn't be hanging around, but is it your thought that it's just much easier to create and sustain change if you go back and identify the root cause versus trying to, it almost seems like it could be a symptom, trying to change symptoms in some sort versus looking at the root cause?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say I'm sorry to hear about your wife. And what we're discussing here, what we've focused in on is the battle of the two schools of therapy today. These two very different approaches, and the purists, the old school therapists, the ones I've described at first, the sort of Freudians, etc., believe that that if you only do CBT, if you only change behaviors, that it doesn't run deep enough, and that for that reason those behaviors will keep on coming back. Put in simplified terms, and and those who do CBT believe something else, and believe that for them the way they do it works better. Certainly, CBT has been shown to work in some circumstances. Crisis control, it's quite good, but I think it's important to appreciate that actually at the end of the day, two things are really important. One, it's very difficult to measure outcomes in psychotherapy. So one approach from the next approach, it's very hard to know really what works, because what are the metrics? How can you really measure people's happinesses and recovery? It's such a nuanced thing. That's number one. Number two, anybody will tell you that therapy is so much about, they say some research seems to show that the leading, most important element of any therapy is actually not the approach itself, but rather the therapeutic alliance between you and the therapist. So that needs to be strong in order for it to work. You've got to like your therapist. You've got to trust your therapist. That's more important than anything. So in a nutshell, my answer is that I don't think anybody knows what's best. What's best is what works best. And for that, you need to experiment with different therapists and different approaches, and you keep on going until you work it out.
So when you mentioned therapeutic alliance, that's interesting. So how much of that maybe has to do with the simple fact of having a human connection with someone who you can finally trust, regardless of whether they're a psychotherapist or not?
Oh, well, yeah, that's massive. That's massive. That's where that's what we're all looking for, isn't it?
I think so.
Psychotherapy, which is sort of Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, which is very popular today. That's very much about, instead of looking back so much, you're creating an ideal relationship with your client and that's creating what you're talking about, somebody you can really trust, somebody you really like, somebody you believe you can open up to, because this person is listening to you with unconditional positive regard. You don't feel there's a judgment there. You don't feel that this person's, as you put it so well, pathologizing your survival adaptations.
Right. That's an interesting way to put it too, survival adaptations. So, because I guess what I've seen just in, running the mental health warriors community, I'm certainly no professional, but what I see is people who have this way of so they've maybe experienced, almost everybody has either, I think 100% of the people I've talked to have experienced some sort of trauma or invalidating experiences of some sort. And what I see is that they've told themselves in a lot of cases these stories, or they've made up these stories, or a specific worldview that served them at that time. So, for example, my father is, I don't know, let's just think of an example. Like every time I show any type of emotion, for example, my father berates me and tells me, calls me all these names, and so I'm never going to show my emotions again. And they get locked into this, way of looking at the world, that it is not safe if I show my emotions, which actually serves them in that moment when there's like actual danger, I guess, emotional danger from doing that. But then they don't have the tools, or I'm not sure what's missing exactly. I'd love to talk about that. But, later in life, when that story then starts, that worldview starts destroying their relationships or doesn't serve them anymore, they don't have the tools or maybe the self-awareness to recognize that and change the way they look at the world. You know what I mean?
I do. And I think that, therapy is a big part of that is absolutely is looking at these outdated adaptations, survival strategies, and saying, look, you needed to do that then, but you actually don't need to do it now. And the fact you're doing it now is causing problems. And of course, that brings a lot of people to their knees, doesn't it? That sort of, they go through relationship after relationship, and they don't understand quite why they're going wrong, but they have a sense that they've probably got some part to do with it. But of course, it's very hard to work all of that out, and quite often it leads to crisis, and that leads to therapy. And in that moment, hopefully we can help them understand what's going on.
Yeah. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? Okay. Nope. So let's talk about dynamic running therapy. So before we do that, 'cause I'm really, really fascinated by this, but before we do this, are you in general an avid runner?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say so. Just a convert. I have just signed up, actually, bizarrely, for 2 half marathons. In my history as a runner, which goes back about 12 years, I've done 1 marathon, which was a disaster. My knees can't make it. And then I've done 2 half marathons. My knees can just take those. But I haven't done one in quite a few years. And actually, somebody that I met at a dinner, we discovered that we both shared the same birthday. And he said, listen, I'm getting tickets my 50th birthday, and I'm getting 50 people together who are born on the same day, and we're going to run it for charity. And I said yes. And then another friend rang me up and said, and said, what are you doing? And I said, why don't you come and join me in this? She said, no, I don't want to do London. I've done London. What about Rome? Next thing I know, she signed up for Rome. So I've got 2 half marathons happening. But no, I keep, I came to dynamic running therapy and the work I do through my own experience, learning how powerful running could be to help stabilize my feelings, to help me feel calmer, and to have a way to feel good and powerful. And I still use it 3 times a week on average. I would say I run by myself, for myself, and then with my clients. Depends how many clients I've got, but generally, we're not in a 50-minute session with my clients. We're not running for 50 minutes. I would say if you averaged it out, it's probably 10 slow minutes.
Yeah, I've run a half marathon once as well. And when I got to the end, the idea of actually doing that again was beyond really my comprehension. But what was interesting about it was a pretty big, so it was in Toronto. I live in Canada, and it's a huge marathon, and they have I think a 10K, a half marathon, and a marathon. So there's some very, professional. I guess there's some professional runners. So there were these Kenyan guys, of course, and I got the chance because the course goes out and then it circles around and comes back, and the course of the half marathon is the half marathon and the full marathon are the same course. It's just after the half marathon, the full marathon breaks off. Anyways, I got the chance to see these Kenyan guys running back. It's unbelievable to see it in real life. I mean, I've seen it on TV watching a marathon, but you cannot appreciate how fast they're running unless you have your own self to compare it to. It's stunning.
It's true. They're in what you and I would call a sprint.
Yeah.
For 2 hours and 8 minutes. They're running faster than we can probably run full stop, let alone for 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. It was amazing. So, but so how did you, I mean, you use dynamic running therapy. I think anybody that works out, for example, I find for myself, I'm a pretty avid, probably neurotic exerciser, but I mean, it definitely has positive benefits for my state of mind. It makes me feel calmer, and it also can be very reflective, especially when I go for a long bike ride or something. So how did you stumble across the idea, I mean, that there was something here that might have, I don't know, like value or something that you could incorporate into your practice?
So let me tell you the story in a nutshell, which, by the way, you'll be able to watch. You'll be able to hear the whole thing in more detail in a TEDx talk that I gave in Manchester last week. It's not up yet, but it will.
Oh, great.
Which is all about this subject, about how I came to it and how it works. So about 11 years ago, I was in a relationship with a woman from another country, another faith, another age, another everything, really. And after a long period of attempts to make it work, and it was a fantastic relationship, the differences, I think, tore us apart. And it led to, and I was turning 40 and I had a real meltdown. And I found myself in my flat, in my apartment, just isolated, and feeling not just depressed, but something more. I don't know what it was. It was sort of extreme fear as well. And it was just a very unpleasant state, really. I think I understand what happens, and for those people who have overinvested in a relationship where you keep on going, even, and giving up more and more of yourself to try to help somebody else, or to try to be with somebody else, or to try to accommodate somebody else, until there's very little left of you, and then finally it blows. It's quite devastating. To go on that journey. So anyway, that's a journey I went on. I realized I needed something to help me get out of this state. And to be honest, I also have to thank my doctor, because he suggested that I go on antidepressants, which I'd never done before. And I took a mild dose, and they really did change a lot. But I took up two things. I took up psychotherapy and running. Your question was, why running? Well, I guess the English spend a lot of time outside. We're a nation of walkers. We love to walk in the countryside. It's a big thing here. And I knew that fresh air in the countryside was really good for me. I knew it gave me space. As you were talking about, it gave me time to reflect. When I'm out, I'm going places, I get a chance to reflect. And so I arranged to meet a friend of mine in Hyde Park, which is near Kensington Palace here in London, right in the centre. It's our sort of central park. And we started walking, and they turned into runs, which was the plan. And we grew from 50 meters a day to 100 meters to a kilometer, until one day we did a whole circuit of the lake that we were going around. But what I noticed during this was that something more than just a bit of camaraderie and fresh air was happening. I noticed how easily we could share our stories, and how they seem to flow, and how they seem to make sense. They seem to have a strange focus upon them. And I don't know, it just blew me away. My friend who actually was American was going through a divorce at the time. So he would tell me about his woes, and I would tell him about my woes. And I think there was a lot of listening happening. And I think when people listen to you, and I do something called empathy runs, which you can see on my website, which is very much about one person running or walking and talking, and the other person listening and then swapping roles. There's something about somebody listening to you for 10 minutes while you're moving and telling your story that really helps you share and focus in on often the very things you've been trying to avoid, or even to discover the correct language to describe perhaps things you've described several times before, but this time you're using a different language for it. Maybe it's more honest, maybe it's more accurate. That's how I came to running therapy.
I've been really interested in lately. So I just read the book. I'm sure I don't know if you've watched a TED Talk by Susan David, but I've watched a TED Talk, and read the book, Emotional Agility. And one of the things that she talks about in the book is just the benefits of there's tons of research showing that expressive writing, which is basically, I'm sure you know what it is, but for the audience, just barfing your thoughts out. The medium is really irrelevant, whether it's on paper or it could be recording it. And then, but it's really just getting your own thoughts out of your own stream of consciousness, I guess, out of your own head. Are the benefits of that? I mean, it sounds like almost if you're doing an empathy run, that it might be the same thing, which is just giving the person an opportunity to get what's going on in their head, out of their head.
God, I've never thought of that before, Jason. I think that's quite a good observation. I'm a big fan of expressive writing, or just journaling, or whatever you want to call it. When I'm in a real state, that's the first thing I do. I get my little black book out and I start just writing down the thoughts exactly as they are. And for whatever reason, it works. As you said, you get it out of your head, you put it on paper. It's not in your head anymore, or at least it's not in your head in the same way. And yes, no, I definitely think the difference between the two is that I think it's really important somehow, the camaraderie that happens when two people are walking or running side by side. I think it taps into a really ancient practice. As you know, our bodies and our DNA, the chemistry in our heads, everything is still primed for being hunter-gatherers and being out there. We're not supposed to be sitting around in little black boxes or looking in little black screens. And we're supposed to be living a different life. And I think that different life is a life of community. It's a life of song and dance and dancing around fires and going on walkabouts and going on adventures and bringing down an animal together. And if for those of your audience that don't hunt I don't hunt either, by the way, but you can still metaphorically do very, very similar things today. You can build a house together, a wooden house for charity. You can build by yourself or with a friend. You can build a canoe. There are so many different things you can do out there. But I think it is a really important healing part about going out together on these walks. We used to be persistence hunters, in fact, there are still people in Africa who are persistence hunters because, our hearts beat a whole lot slower than, say, a gazelle. So if you start following a gazelle, it takes off at high speed and its heart really, really thumps. And if you can track it, get to it again quickly enough, it'll take off again. But after a while, after about 3 hours of this, it'll get absolutely exhausted. And then when you come up on it next time, it'll just be lying there and you can do what you want with it. And we used to do that either, for years and years in Africa. We do that alone, or we do that in groups. Or you drive animal down into holes or into caves or into caverns or into valleys. And you needed to work together to do that. And you'd spend a whole day going out hunting together or walking together or looking for something, whatever it might be. So, yeah, there's something in the walking and the running and the talking that I think is hugely curing.
I love that idea, how you're thinking about, our evolution. I mean, we talked earlier about how some therapies like CBT maybe focus on behavior and trying to change behavior that's happening right now, while other schools are or the competing school of traditional psychotherapy looks at, maybe childhood and what happened there, but even taking a much further view back to where we actually came from as a species, I think is a really interesting and important idea, because we're so far from where we came from, and it's such an incredibly short period of time. So I imagine that must play a huge role. I mean, I think it's obvious, looking around in the world, that it's playing a significant role in the overall mental health of us as a society.
I think so, and I think that was happening since the Industrial Revolution. I think that people stuck in cities together doing repetitive jobs, I don't think it's good for the soul. But then throw in computers and phones and social media and that second world of the digital world, and I just think it's so far away from everything that's good for you. All of the hormones that get triggered when you sing together, or you build a fire together, or you cook together, or all the things that we've done. If people are feeling anxious, there are really obvious things they can do to help that anxiety. It may call for a serious change in lifestyle, but there are things that are really not that complicated to go off and try and do. And a lot of them have to do with community, and a lot of them have to do with getting out and doing things. A great way to treat depression, two great ways to treat depression is through community activities like joining a choir, but also giving back is massive. If you work in a soup kitchen, something like that can really, there's something about the helping of others that helps us help ourselves pretty much faster than anything else.
This is what I'm extremely interested in, because I'm giving a talk next yet about a month to so my first wife was a police officer, so I've done a fair amount of work with first responders, and I just see this pattern that repeats over and over again. So somebody experiences, obviously many people who experience trauma are, feel called into helping professions like being a first responder. So perhaps they're more susceptible to trauma. I don't really know, and then of course they get on the job and they experience all this horrible stuff. But what I see happening to them is, and I don't understand it completely, but what I see happening to them is so many of them just get caught in this, like their whole life is the trauma they've experienced. And so what they do sometimes is they pull away, because they feel ostracized from this tribe. Like you just mentioned, being part of a community, for example. So they're part of a tribe. And I don't know how it is in England, but in North America, it's one of these tribes where, typically if you're strong, you're welcome. And if you're not, you're basically kicked out. So, as soon as you experience some kind of mental health issue or whatever, there's this real feeling of stigma because you're not, quote, strong enough to do the job. So they lose this sense of tribe. And then they pull back and they don't surround themselves with anybody. Or what happens to so many of them is they get around these groups of people who've all experienced trauma, and all they talk about is trauma, and they don't get better. And I sometimes when I have a conversation with people, I'm like, we have a powerful, uplifting conversation with them. And at the end of it, I ask them, like, God, do you feel better? I'm not saying but just, do you feel better as a result of having this conversation? And they always say, yes, of course. And I think I always say, God, like, okay, so are you open to considering that maybe you want to be a little more proactive in creating the opportunities to have more of these conversations in your life? I mean, because I don't know, I just kind of went on a monologue there, but I feel like there's so much to what you're saying. It's about being proactive. And you mentioned when you were talking about going for a run, that you feel powerful. And I think those feelings are so important to understanding that you can actually take ownership of your life and start to heal.
Absolutely. Well, we're on the same page there, Jason. You know what, we're missing all of our rituals, particularly as I was going to say, particularly as men. I don't know if that's true, but let's just say that I'm very aware of it as a man. That many of the rituals that we're supposed to go through seem to be missing, and I think that to sit there and to go over the same. Listen, if you're suicidal and you need to create a new tribe of people who've been through the same trauma as you and to go over it again, and that's the only thing that keeps you alive, then I think that's a reasonable choice. If you've tried everything else, but have you tried everything else is my question, because I really do think that once you've gone through that initial traumatic period and maybe you've got some psych education around it and maybe you've had some healing of one sort or another, I think there's a danger in staying in that community for too long. I think there's an opportunity to, as you're saying, to power up, to learn what you need to learn, to even turn some of what you've been through into a plus, and to go and find a new life for yourself. But to do that, you're going to need to challenge yourself and maybe do something very different. If you work in an office, then go and work in a forest. Do something very different.
How much of this do you think is just typically, like, one of the things I wonder about is, so, if you look at somebody, say, for example, who's experienced trauma, and why I got into this whole idea of what I'm calling emotional excellence is because when I talked to people, I started to realize it was a couple things. One was I interviewed a guy in the podcast who's doing some really amazing work with for veterans coming back, and when he was describing their program. I run mastermind groups for men, so group coaching programs for men, and we teach a lot of skills like, identifying your core values, writing, creating an evocative vision of the future. So it creates continuity between the person you are right now and, this person that you will become if you live your core values, and identifying and overcoming limiting beliefs and all this kind of stuff. And so when I was talking to this guy in the podcast, he's describing this program that's getting incredible results with veterans. He's basically started describing almost the same thing that we're doing in our masterminds, which is really what led me down this path of thinking, man, maybe there's really something to this, because I think that people in general, and I'd love your opinion on this, they feel almost like passengers in their own life, like regardless of mental health issues, just in general. You grow up, you're told what to do, you go to school, you graduate, you might go to college and you get a job. It's not a question of whether you like it or not. It's just like you're feeding into the machine, I guess. And I think people feel generally pretty powerless to take ownership of their own situation. And so if you add mental health issues in that, I can see how just that feeling of being a passenger would just carry right on into that experience, and people would feel like they have a limited capability to change their lives.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. And of course, I think that it's, people do a deal with the devil, right? They go and sit in an office and they sell insurance, and it's boring, but it pays well, and the family and the wife is happy, or the other way around, maybe it's the wife doing the injuring, the husband's at home looking after the kids, and everybody's reasonably happy. But they're only reasonably happy, and it's a deal you've done with the devil often. It's not an empowering job. It's not a particularly plural job. It's not a job full of and some men, actually, I think this should be said, and women, some men actually find the workplace quite a competitive and exciting theatre, which is not unlike the tribal one or the outside one, hunting down animals. And I think for them, the office can be very exciting. They can really enjoy the sense of coming together to build plans for your business. They can enjoy the competition and the status that comes from doing well. But if you're not getting that and you're in that job anyway, then that's a lousy place to find yourself, because that's going to be disempowering. In the end, that's going to be deeply disempowering. You're not testing yourself. There are no moments of overcoming. There are no moments of I just don't think that's going to give you much. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I look at what I found is for me, like I was the same way. I actually got something, I think, out of, and a younger version of me got something. I get quite a bit out of the competitive nature of it. But I find as I get older and I learn more, and I look at my day job as an opportunity to, create human connection and psychological safety, and to try to help, people be the very best that they can be and teach them skills. Like, for example, I got my team together a couple of weeks ago and taught them all about emotional validation, because I want them to be not only like these types of fundamental life skills are not just, they don't make you just more effective at work. They make you more effective everywhere in your life. So, I mean, when I approach it that way, I love it. Makes it, but I get it. I get that many people are just, basically feel like they're locked in a cubicle. So, one thing I'm very interested in is when you come up with an idea. So, say in the field of psychotherapy, if you come up with an idea like dynamic running therapy, that is perhaps non-traditional or goes against the grain, like how does that work in that field? Is there like resistance to that as you start talking about it, or do people look at you as like you've gone off the reservation or whatever?
Well, in this country, there's reluctance to be in therapy at all. It's changing a little bit, but the Brits, we're all about stiff upper lip and sort of Churchill and getting on with things, and that's certainly the case with a lot of men still. So any kind of therapy is a problem. And then when you bring in something unusual like running therapy, it's I've got a book, I've got a lot of press around it, and I've got a fair number of clients, and people like to do it, but the right people like to do it. We're not a very progressive, so it's progressive people who are trying it out. Whereas I think America is a much more progressive place. Much of my ambition lies in America, actually. I've lived there for many years. I spent, I don't know, 15 odd years in America, and went to Wake Forest University and University of Miami. And so I lived in the Carolinas, and I've spent a lot of time over there, 8 years in Florida for my sins. And I've definitely got a lot of that American positive psychology. So for me, I'm like, whatever works, right? And let's bring in running. Let's bring in the body. Let's use the body to change the spirit. Let's empower people through the body, which will then empower them, their confidence, their sense of agency, etc. It's so obvious to me. So I didn't hesitate. I just wish I'd done it all in America. And I may well move back to the States in the next year, but I'm here and I've done it here. And there's been some. Actually, there's been actually no real pushback. There just hasn't been as much uptake as there could be. But I mean, as I said, there's been plenty. There's plenty of press, and I've got a book in 8 countries now. So it must be resonating at a pretty big level, but I still think it's fairly early days for it. There are quite a few running therapists in the States now as well. There's some in Germany. There's one in Israel.
So what about from like the professional environment, like from your colleagues, I guess, where you introduce a new idea like this? Like how would something like that typically be received?
Oh, okay. So in a professional, sorry, that's probably what you were asking.
No, that's okay.
So I'm a member. There are 2 governing bodies here, the UKCP and the BACP. The BACP is a British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, and they have been fully supportive. Probably half the therapists in the country belong to the BACP and the other half to the UKCP. They've been fully supportive. They're an umbrella organization, and they support all kinds of therapy. And there are so many approaches now. There's just hundreds of them. So I'm just the latest in a long line, and they decided long ago to support any kind of therapy that looked as though it made sense and was being practiced by a fully qualified person. I'm not doing anything particularly unusual in my running therapy. I'm using pretty much regular therapy, talk therapy, and I'm just using it while running and walking and sitting. So it's not much of a stretch for them.
Right. So you mentioned earlier in our conversation that so you mentioned a couple of things. One, you saw one of the benefits of dynamic running therapy about, being with somebody and being able to talk and get the thoughts out of your head, and that sense of connection. And then you also mentioned that you practice it yourself. And so I guess my question was, when you practice it yourself, are you running with somebody or are you running by yourself? And if you're running by yourself, I mean, is there I talked to a guy in the podcast a few months ago who does a lot of running. And one of the things he said was when he started running, he was extremely depressed, and really his runs became just another way of, I guess, practicing his self-loathing. Like the voice in his head would just be beating himself up. So if somebody does it by themselves, I mean, what are some strategies, I guess, to prevent just the same negative self-talk, from running through your head? Or is it not dynamic running therapy if you are actually running by yourself?
No, you can do it by yourself. That's what the book is for. It gives you specific programs for running with anxiety, for depression, with anger, for relationship problems. So there are a bunch of questions that I ask you to run with and explore during your run, and meditate on, if you like. The book is also full of a lot of stuff about how you relate to yourself. So a lot of it's about that negative self-talk that you're talking about. So I believe that I can help people even by themselves with a book. I believe that I can help them get close to what's really happening, taking them on a journey of discovery around depression, and around looking at how it is they've come to treat themselves the way they treat themselves, and then asking themselves whether that's outdated, as we were talking about earlier on, whether there's room for more compassion, room for more gentleness, and room for more complexity. There's a lot of black and white thinking goes on, so I ask people to run with that, to explore. There's a lot of journaling going on in the book, so that you write down and then examine the language that you're using with yourself and examine those ideas. Once it's on paper, it's amazing how much easier it is to see how absurd some of what you're thinking and saying is, and how repetitive it is. And that gives you an opportunity to make some changes there, and to run through it.
What do you think? It's funny you say that. I was talking to a friend of mine who's dealing with some, just totally negative, or not negative, but counterproductive thought patterns. And I think what you said is really powerful in the sense that when him and he really lives inside the echo chamber of his own head. And when we were talking, we talked for a long time, about a couple months ago, and as he's just repeating these same things that go on in his head about basically how even the smallest type of change is impossible. But I can see the look on his face as he's speaking to me, that as he's saying it actually out loud and trying to justify it, how unbelievably absurd what he's saying is. But he never had the chance to recognize that, because I guess he's so comfortable with the narrative running in his own head that I don't know, I don't know how this works. Maybe we could talk about this for a minute. But like when people have a narrative running in their own head, I feel like they think that's them in some way. Like what makes it so powerful about getting out of your own head onto paper? And what is it about just when it stays in your own head? Do people associate this way of thinking with who they actually are, and they don't think they can separate themselves from it?
Well, I'm afraid that I think men in particular can get very rigid in their thinking. Mm-hmm. I think anybody can, but I think men are prone to it. We tend to sort of paint ourselves into corners. There's different reasons to understand why that may be happening. some people believe that all men are on an autistic scale, and that autism is linked to black and white thinking and rigid thinking. I don't know. All I know is that people change when they're ready and when the opportunity arises, and quite often that can take an awfully long time. And not all therapy is a success by any means. And your friend, you can sit there in front of somebody who's perfectly intelligent and make the case for something, and it just goes straight over their head, and there's nothing much you can do about that. It's just about timing. And quite often, what you need to do as a therapist, what you do is you ask more questions and you do more listening, and you hope that at some point the bit that's making it rigid starts to show up, and then that's the bit that loosens up, because all the rest of it, the thoughts that are repetitive and negative, are really just a symptom of that, and they're reinforcing that. Often, as men, it's because it's out of fear. We've got ourselves into a point where we can't possibly admit that it's us. It's gone so far now, and so we just keep on telling ourselves whatever it may be. It's why you have, and I know this isn't a show just for men, but why you have such dreadful things as family annihilations and things like that. Men get very, very rigid, and they can get very, very stuck in ways of believing things. And then everything starts to reinforce that idea until finally, and on a lesser level, you've seen it in American politics, where you get this extremely polarized thinking. And it's just, to my mind anyway, anytime you're really polarized, believing that you absolutely can't change anything, or that this is absolutely wrong and you're absolutely right, anytime you're dealing with absolutes, then you're probably not on the best ground, in my mind.
I completely agree with you. So when you talk about men, so you mentioned the idea that maybe all men are somewhere on the autism scale, but I mean, what else is there that makes men that way? Like, how much of it is societal versus genetic, perhaps? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, well,
I mean, I know that's a huge question, but
you could talk about that for hours. I think the idea of what a man is and what a woman is, I think increasingly looks ludicrous, particularly in this age where there's so much, or apparently a growing amount of movement between male and female, and all sorts of different kinds of classifications. I think that women are strong and men are strong. Women need sex, men need sex. Maybe there's different amounts of this and that here and there, but essentially, I don't think that they're so different. What I do think is the case is that those differences, including our hormones and our physical abilities, has led to us to adopt certain ways of being that we identify as male and female. So women have, knowing that their strong point is not going to be taking on men in physical battle, they have made their strong point the emotional world. I'm talking massive outdated stereotypes here, so
right.
You'll probably get some people writing and saying nobody writes anymore. But yeah, women research seems to show that women talk more and exist on more of an emotional plane than men do. And men have learned that they have the advantage when it comes to power, physical power. And so they build things, and they threaten other people until they've got more than they've got. And they compete, and they get lots of status, and then they get to reproduce a lot. It's all about survival and reproduction, right?
Yeah, I think I would used to look at it as almost like instead of a disagreement about something as an opportunity for both of us to learn. I looked at it as a zero sum game where there was a winner and a loser, and it was really important to me to be the winner. So I think that was something, that way of looking at the world really contributed to the rigidity of my thinking. Which really is obviously incredibly limiting. And so much of it was based around fear as well, of being, because if I wasn't the winner, then obviously I was the loser. But I wonder how much of it has to do with, like, so when you see a patient, for example, I mean, I think for me, I battled alcoholism not really, well, I guess as a result of my wife's illness and death. But I think there was some fundamental underlying ways of looking at the world that contributed to it as well, obviously. But for me, like logically, I knew what I was doing was terrible. But at some level, I knew it was terrible. But I was so ensnared in this web of rationalizations. Like I look back on it now, and I think it's crazy. And because I'm a relatively intelligent human being, and I was at the time, but I was so locked into this way of thinking. But I think one of the things that drove it was that as much as I did not like what I was doing and the impact that it was causing, I was so afraid of the uncertainty of doing something else, because what if it was even worse than what I already had? And I wonder, in your experience, how much of that type of thinking is like, as bad as this is, the alternative could be worse, without even having any kind of tools to even imagine a more abundant and evocative future? Like, how much does that hold people back?
Yeah, I think that people think, well, as you said, I don't want to think the possibility that I might be wrong about this. And if I'm wrong about this, there's a possibility I'm wrong about everything else. And if I'm wrong about everything else, or more stuff, and stuff that I can't even see, that suggests I may be a lot weaker and lower status than I think that I am. And therefore, I've got a real problem here. And therefore, let me make sure that I fight for my life in this conversation and make this person believe that I'm right, not least of all the person that I am, not just the person I'm talking to, but me, myself, make myself believe that I'm right. And I think that as we get older, we learn and we soften up. And I think it's a survival thing. If you think about what it's like to be young, you're sort of cocksure about things, and there's not a lot of reflection going on, and you're shooting from the hip, really. And that's because you need to be when you're, to be a sort of 20-year-old male or 25-year-old male is the most dangerous point in your life. That's when you're most likely to get killed by another male. So you need to appear strong, and you need to be assured of your convictions, and you need to convince other people that you're sure of your convictions, because if you appear wishy-washy to them, they're going to victimize you. As you get older, you learn that life is more complex, and your testosterone levels drop, and all sorts of things happen. And you learn that really that you're going to have to work with your colleagues. There's a better way of doing things, that force might have been the most important thing to you at 20, but now you're not looking for survival, you're looking for prosperity. And prosperity comes from cooperation. And so then you go to that place that you've talked about, where suddenly you're less rigid, and you realize, well, actually, there are very few facts on the ground. There are only opinions. And my opinion, no matter how informed it is not really worth much more than my partner's. She believes that it's whatever the example may be. But I think that's kind of how it works out.
Yeah, I agree with you. So when you are there, when you're seeing, do you call them clients or patients? What's the word you clients? Okay. So when you see a client, I mean, what type of person or what type of state are they in that makes them a great candidate for dynamic running therapy? I guess is everybody a great candidate? Maybe is a simpler way of asking the question.
No, most definitely not everybody. Well, for a start, you need to be mobile. What people do is they read about me and they read about me as a running therapist and they think that's a great idea. And then they ring up and we discuss and they say, oh, well, I'm really not very fit and I can't imagine talking while I'm running. And I explain that it's client led, which means they're going to decide when we walk and when we run and when we sit. And that's going to be an important part of our work together. So there's no reason for them to fear that, and that it's not about getting fit. And so there's, again, no reason to fear that. But if they want to do it and they're keen to do it, then and they can move, that makes